Lower the lights. Put on your headphones. This story begins now.
Some confessions are spoken because they need to be heard. Others are written because the writer isn't ready to survive the sound of their own voice. Tonight's story isn't about discovery, that it's about what happens when truth is placed quietly in your path and waits. This is a story about living beside something unsaid, about the weight of knowing without confronting, about love that doesn't break, but shifts. So if you're listening in the dark, if the world has finally gone quiet, stay with me. This is the confession found in the drawer. I wasn't looking for anything when I opened the drawer. That detail matters, because it's the only reason I didn't feel guilty at first. The drawer belonged to the small table by the window, the one that never held more than old receipts, a dead pen, and sometimes a spare key that didn't open anything anymore. I opened it because it stuck. It always did. You had to lift it slightly, then pull. That night, it opened too easily, like it had been waiting. Inside, there was a folded sheet of paper. Just one. Not tucked beneath anything, not hidden. Resting flat, as if it had been placed there deliberately, knowing it would eventually be found. My name was written on the outside in handwriting I recognized immediately. Yours. Careful, restrained, like you were trying not to let the letters lean too far in any direction. I closed the drawer again and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the room breathe around me. You were asleep in the bedroom. I knew that because I could hear the soft, uneven rhythm of your breathing through the half-open door. We had gone to bed late, after a quiet evening that hadn't asked much of either of us. There was no argument, no tension hanging in the air. Just the ordinary fatigue of shared days. That made the paper feel heavier somehow, like it didn't belong to this version of the night. I sat on the edge of the couch and held the folded page in both hands without opening it. The lamp was off. Streetlight filtered in through the curtains, turning the room into a collection of shadows and familiar shapes. I told myself I could put it back. That finding it didn't mean I had to read it. That some things existed without asking to be known. But my name was there, written clearly, calmly, as if it had already decided. When I unfolded the paper, it made a sound that felt too loud. The kind of sound that carries in a quiet house. I paused, listening for movement from the bedroom, but your breathing stayed steady. You didn't stir. The first line wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It simply began. I don't know when you'll read this, it said. I only know that if you're holding it, then I didn't stop myself in time. I read that sentence 3 times before moving on. Not because it was confusing, but because it suggested something unfinished. Something still in motion. You wrote as if the moment of discovery mattered more than the moment of writing. As if this confession was always meant to exist in the space between us, not spoken, not entirely hidden. You wrote about small things first. Harmless ones. Habits I already knew about. The way you sometimes stayed awake after I fell asleep, listening to the house settle. How you reread old messages, not because you missed anyone in particular, but because you wanted to remember how it felt to be someone else once. These were not secrets. They were admissions. Quiet, careful ones. The kind you don't think need forgiveness. Then the tone shifted. Not abruptly. Just enough to feel it in my chest. You wrote about a moment you never mentioned before. A choice you made years ago, before we met, that followed you into every room without making a sound. You didn't name it directly. You circled it, describing how it changed the way you looked at people, how it taught you to listen without interrupting, how it made you careful with happiness. I realized as I read that this wasn't a confession meant to shock. It was meant to explain. I kept glancing toward the bedroom door, half expecting you to appear there, watching me read words you never planned to say out loud. But you stayed asleep. The house stayed still. The night didn't interfere. That felt intentional too, as if the silence was part of what you were giving me. Near the bottom of the page, your handwriting grew slightly uneven. Not messy, just human. You wrote that you were tired of carrying this alone, but more afraid of setting it down in the wrong place. That you didn't want to tell me because telling would make it real in a way you weren't sure we could survive. You said you loved me without using the word love. You said you trusted me without asking for trust back. The last line was the quietest of all. If I'm still here when you read this, you wrote, then I hope you understand why I needed you to find it instead of hearing it. I folded the paper carefully, exactly the way it had been before. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel relieved. I felt something unfinished, like a sentence cut off before its final word. I put the confession back into the drawer and closed it gently, lifting slightly so it wouldn't catch. Then I sat in the dark, listening to your breathing, and wondered how long the paper had been waiting for me. I didn't sleep after that. Not really. I lay beside you and let the hours pass without counting them, listening to the small sounds your body made in rest. The way your breathing sometimes caught, just briefly, before finding its rhythm again. The faint shift of sheets when you turned in your sleep. I kept thinking about the drawer, about how close it was to the bedroom, about how something so important could exist only a few steps away without either of us acknowledging it. In the morning, you acted the same. That was the hardest part. You moved through the kitchen with your familiar quiet efficiency, rinsing a mug before setting it in the rack, asking if I'd slept well without really waiting for the answer. Your voice held no trace of the words I had read. No hesitation. No guilt I could name. If the confession had been a test, I was the only one taking it. I wondered how long you had lived like this. Carrying something that shaped the way you spoke, the way you listened, the way you loved, all without letting it surface. The letter had made it clear that this wasn't a recent wait. It was old, settled, integrated into you. And yet you had written it as if it were still moving, still capable of change, depending on when I found it. I went about my day with the strange awareness that I was now holding knowledge you didn't know I had. It wasn't power. It didn't feel like that. It felt like standing in a room after the lights had gone out, memorizing the shapes so you wouldn't bump into them later. I replayed your sentences in my head while answering emails, while walking past strangers who had no idea how fragile a shared life could be. That evening, I opened the drawer again, not because I wanted to reread the letter, because I wanted to understand its placement. It was still there, exactly where I had left it, untouched. You hadn't checked. Or if you had, you hadn't moved it. That told me something I wasn't ready to name yet. I sat at the table this time, the letter unfolded under the lamp. Reading it again didn't change the words, but it changed me. I noticed how carefully you avoided assigning blame, even to yourself. How you framed the past not as a mistake, but as a turning point you never stepped away from. You wrote about consequences without listing them, about responsibility without drama. It was the voice of someone who had already spent years reckoning, writing not to confess, but to be seen. There was a paragraph I hadn't lingered on before. One where you described imagining this moment, me finding the paper, and how you thought I might react. You didn't picture anger or tears. You pictured quiet, distance, a pause long enough to feel like absence. You wrote that this was the outcome you feared most, because silence was where this thing had lived best. That line stayed with me. Over the next few days, nothing happened. which was, in its own way, something. We talked about errands, about work, about what to make for dinner. You laughed at something on your phone and showed it to me without hesitation. Your hand found mine in the usual places. If you were waiting for something to change, you didn't show it. If you were afraid, you carried it the way you always carried things, inward. At night, I lay awake and imagined different versions of the conversation we weren't having. In some, I confronted you immediately, the letter held out between us like evidence. In others, I pretended I'd never seen it, letting the knowledge quietly reshape how I understood you. None of these imagined moments felt right. They all asked for a resolution the letter itself had refused to give. I began to understand that the confession wasn't an ending. It was an invitation, not to forgive, not even to respond, but to notice, to hold the truth alongside the person, without forcing them to merge too quickly. You had trusted me with that balance, even if you didn't know I'd accepted it yet. One afternoon, while you were out, I found myself standing in front of the drawer again, hand hovering over the handle. I thought about what would happen if I removed the letter, hid it somewhere else, destroyed it, all the ways I could assert control over this fragile new arrangement. I did none of them. I opened the drawer, looked at the folded paper, and closed it again. That night, you asked me if everything was all right. Not casually, not as a placeholder question. You asked it the way someone does when they've been listening closely. I told you yes, which was both true and not. You studied my face for a moment longer than usual, then nodded. Accepted it. That acceptance felt heavier than suspicion would have. I realized then that the confession wasn't meant to absolve you. It was meant to give me a choice without demanding it, to let me decide how much truth I wanted to live with, and in what shape. You were still here, alive, sharing meals with me, and yet a part of you had stepped back, waiting. Before we went to bed, you opened the drawer yourself. I watched from the doorway, heart tightening, but you didn't touch the letter. You took out a pen instead, scribbled something on a scrap of paper, and closed the drawer again. You smiled at me, tired and familiar, and turned off the light. In the dark, I wondered if you knew, or if you were simply living alongside the possibility, the way you always had. And I wondered how long a truth could sit between two people before it asked to be spoken, or quietly chose to remain exactly where it was. After that night, the drawer stopped feeling like furniture. It became a presence. Not intrusive, not demanding, just there. Like an extra person in the room who never spoke but heard everything. I noticed how often my eyes drifted toward it without my permission. How my body remembered its location even when my mind tried not to. You didn't change your habits. That was the quiet cruelty of it. You still left the house keys in the same place. Still hummed under your breath when you thought you were alone. Still reached for me in sleep, your hand finding the small of my back with unconscious certainty. If guilt lived in you, it had learned to coexist with love without disturbing it. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, you told me a story I had heard before. A small one. Something about a person you once knew who made a decision they couldn't undo. You told it casually, without emphasis, your hands moving through soap and water as if this were just another anecdote. But this time, I heard the story differently. I heard the pauses, the places where your voice slowed, the words you chose not to say. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I let the story end where you let it end. You glanced at me afterward, quick and searching, then turned back to the sink. That glance stayed with me longer than the story itself. Later that night, I opened the drawer again. The letter was still there, but something else had joined it. The scrap of paper you'd written on days earlier. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't addressed to me. There was no name at all. Just one sentence, written in the same careful hand. Some truths don't need witnesses to be real. I read it once. Then again. It felt like an answer to a question I hadn't asked out loud. Or maybe a reminder, for you or for me, that this thing between us didn't require performance. That it could exist quietly, unconfirmed, and still shape us. I left both papers where they were. From that point on, time began to behave strangely. Days passed that felt untouched by the confession. We laughed. We planned small things. We talked about the future without defining it too sharply. And then there were moments, small, unremarkable ones, where the weight of what I knew pressed in on me unexpectedly. When you apologized too quickly. When you listened a little too closely. When you hesitated before saying my name. I started to understand that knowing something about a person doesn't always bring you closer. Sometimes it simply changes the distance. Not farther, not nearer, just different. There were nights when I almost told you I had read it. The words gathered at the back of my throat, rehearsed and ready. I imagined your face when you realized the secret had crossed the boundary you'd drawn for it. Relief, maybe, or fear, or something more complicated than either. But each time I stopped. Not because I was afraid of hurting you, but because I wasn't sure what speaking would accomplish. The confession had already done its work. It had altered the way I saw you without asking you to perform penance. It had allowed me to witness something private without demanding resolution. Speaking it aloud felt like changing the terms of that agreement. One morning, as you were leaving for work, you paused by the drawer. You didn't open it. You just rested your hand on it briefly, as if checking that it was still real. Still there. You looked at me then, really looked, and something unspoken passed between us. Not understanding, not acknowledgement, just recognition. That was when I realized the confession wasn't waiting to be discussed. It was waiting to be lived with. Weeks passed, maybe longer. The drawer remained untouched. The papers inside aged quietly, absorbing the normalcy of our days. Sometimes I forgot about them entirely. Other times, I felt their presence like a low hum beneath everything else. Neither state felt permanent. Both felt honest. I thought often about the moment you decided to write it. About the version of you who sat somewhere, maybe in the same room, maybe not, and chose paper instead of voice. That choice mattered more to me than the content itself. It told me you understood something essential, that some truths need time, not confrontation. One night, long after the letter had stopped surprising me, I dreamed that the drawer was empty. I woke with a strange sense of loss, as if something important had been taken without my permission. I lay there listening to you breathe, realizing that I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I was afraid of its absence. In the morning, the drawer was unchanged. The letter remained. The sentence remained. And you remained alive, present, imperfect, and real. I never told you I found it. Not because I didn't care. Not because I forgave or condemned. But because the confession had already become part of the quiet architecture of our life. Unseen, load-bearing, and necessary. Somewhere between knowing and saying, we learned how to continue. And sometimes late at night, when the house is still and the drawer sits patiently where it always has, I wonder if you wrote it for me at all, or if you wrote it simply so the truth would have a place to rest. Some truths don't demand answers, they ask for space. Maybe you've known someone for years and still sensed there was a room inside them you'd never entered. Maybe you've held a secret, not to protect yourself, but to protect what you were afraid might change if spoken aloud. This story doesn't tell you what the right choice is. It only reminds us that silence can be a decision too, and sometimes a compassionate one. If this stayed with you longer than you expected, that's all right. That's where night stories belong. Thank you for listening. Rest well.